Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Laura Kovacs, and I am honored to introduce our guest this evening. Yaa Gyasi's unforgettable debut novel follows the story of two half-sisters, separated by forces beyond their control. One sold into slavery, the other married to a British slaver. The book traces the generations of family who follow, across 300 years of history, as the legacy of slavery is fully revealed in light of the present day. It was a New York Times bestseller and 2016 notable book and a Guardian Best Book, and it was nominated for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize. In her New York Times book review, Isabel Wilkerson says that the great, aching gift of the novel is that it offers, in its own way, the very thing that enslavement denied its descendants, the possibility of imagining the connection between the broken threads of their origins. Acclaimed for portraying the cultural and socio-political issues of his native Jamaica, Kei Miller is the author of the novels The Last Warner Woman and The Same Earth, the story collection The Fear of Stones, and several collections of poetry, including the award-winning The Cartographer Tries to Map a Way to Zion. A creative writing teacher at the University of London, he is a recipient of the Forward Prize for Poetry and an International Writers' Fellowship at the University of Iowa, and he was shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize. In Augustown, he explores cultural, religious, and racial divisions in Jamaican society amid a wider dialogue about written and oral storytelling, the way myths can shift in their retelling, and how history is composed of different stories wrestling for legitimacy. And more than that, he shows the importance of who tells these stories and how they are told. A reviewer for The Guardian writes that the book exerts a hold, the language clear as spring water. Please first welcome Yaa Gyasi to the stage.
Hi, everyone, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to Kei for sharing this event with me. I'm really happy to be here. So Homegoing is a novel that follows the family lineage of two half-sisters. Afia, the first half-sister, is the wife of the British governor of the Cape Coast Castle, which is a slave fort that still stands in what is now known as Cape Coast, Ghana. Essie, the second sister, is kept in the castle as a slave before being sent to America. And the novel moves through the years, descendant after descendant, ending roughly in the present day. So I'm just going to read a little bit to you from the beginning of the novel, Afia's chapter, and I'll just launch right in. The night Afia Otre was born into the musky heat of Fanti land, a fire raged through the woods just outside her father's compound. It moved quickly, tearing a path for days. It lived off the air. It slept in caves and hidden trees. It burned up and through, unconcerned with what wreckage it left behind, until it reached an Ashanti village. There, it disappeared, becoming one with the night. Afia's father, Kobi Otre, left his first wife, Baba, with the new baby so that he might survey the damage to his yams, that most precious crop known far and wide to sustain families. Kobi had lost 7 yams, and he felt each loss as a blow to his own family. He knew then that the memory of the fire that burned, then fled, would haunt him, his children, and his children's children for as long as the line continued. When he came back into Baba's hut to find Afia, the child of the night's fire, shrieking into the air, he looked at his wife and said, "We will never again speak of what happened today." The villagers began to say that the baby was born of the fire, that this was the reason Baba had no milk. Afia was nursed by Kobi's second wife, who had just given birth to a son 3 months before. Afia would not latch on, and when she did, her sharp gums would tear at the flesh around the woman's nipples until she became afraid to feed the baby. Because of this, Afia grew thinner, skin on small bird-like bones, with a large black hole of a mouth that expelled a hungry cry which could be heard throughout the village even on the days Baba did her best to smother it, covering the baby's lips with the rough palm of her left hand. "Love her," Kobe commanded, as though love were as simple an act as lifting food up from an iron plate and past one's lips. At night, Baba dreamed of leaving the baby in the dark forest so that the god Nyame could do with her as he pleased. Afia grew older. The summer after her 3rd birthday, Baba had her first son. The boy's name was Fifi, and he was so fat that sometimes when Baba wasn't looking, Afia would roll him along the ground like a ball. The first day that Baba let Afia hold him, she accidentally dropped him. The baby bounced on his buttocks, landed on his stomach, and looked up at everyone in the room, confused as to whether or not he should cry. He decided against it, but Baba, who had been stirring benku, lifted her stirring stick and beat Afia across her bare back. Each time the stick lifted off of the girl's body, it would leave behind hot, sticky pieces of benku that burned into her flesh. By the time Baba had finished, Afia was covered with sores, screaming and crying. From the floor, rolling this way and that on his belly, Fifi looked at Afia with his saucer eyes, but made no noise. Kobe came home to find his other wives attending to Afia's wounds and understood immediately what had happened. He and Baba fought well into the night. Afia could hear them through the thin walls of the hut where she lay on her floor, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep. In her dream, Kobe was a lion and Baba was a tree. The lion plucked the tree from the ground where it stood and slammed it back down. The tree stretched its branches in protest, and the lion ripped them off one by one. The tree, horizontal, began to cry red ants that traveled down the thin cracks between its bark. The ants pooled on the soft earth around the top of the tree trunk. And so the cycle began. Baba beat Afia. Kobe beat Baba. By the time Afia had reached age 10, she could recite a history of the scars on her body. The summer of 1764, when Baba broke yams across her back. The spring of 1767, when Baba bashed her left foot with a rock, breaking her big toe so that it now always pointed away from the other toes. For each scar on Afia's body, there was a companion scar on Baba's, but that didn't stop mother from beating daughter, father from beating mother. Matters were only made worse by Afia's blossoming beauty. When she was 12, her breasts arrived, 2 lumps that sprung from her chest, as soft as mango flesh. The men of the village knew that first blood would soon follow, and they waited for the chance to ask Baba and Kobe for her hand. The gift started. One man tapped palm wine better than anyone else in the village, but another's fishing nets were never empty. Kobe's family feasted off of Afia's burgeoning womanhood. Their bellies, their hands, were never empty. In 1775, Ajwa Edu became the first girl of the village to be proposed to by one of the British soldiers. She was light-skinned and sharp-tongued. In the mornings, after she had bathed, she rubbed shea butter all over her body, underneath her breasts and between her legs. Afia didn't know her well, but she had seen her naked one day when Baba sent her to carry palm oil to the girl's hut. Her skin was slick and shiny, her hair regal. The first time the white man came, Ajwa's mother asked Afia's parents to show him around the village while Ajwa prepared herself for him. "Can I come?" Afia asked, running after her parents as they walked. She heard Baba's no in one ear and Kobe's yes in the other. Her father's ear won, and soon Afia was standing before the first white man she had ever seen. "He is happy to meet you," the translator said, as the white man held his hand out to Afia. She didn't accept it. Instead, she hid behind her father's leg and watched him. He wore a coat that had shiny gold buttons down the middle. It strained against his paunch. His face was red, as though his neck were a stump on fire. He was fat all over and sweating huge droplets from his forehead and above his upper lip. Afia started to think of him as a rain cloud, sallow and wet and shapeless. "Please, he would like to see the village," the translator said, and they all began to walk. They stopped first by Afia's own compound. "This is where we live," Afia told the white man, and he smiled at her dumbly, his green eyes hidden in fog. He didn't understand. Even after his translator spoke to him, he didn't understand. Kobe held Afia's hand as he and Baba led the white man through the compound. "Here, in this village," Kobe said, "each wife has her own hut. This is the hut she shares with her children. When it is her husband's night to go to her, he goes to her in her hut." The white man's eyes grew clearer as the translation was given, and suddenly Afia realized that he was seeing through new eyes. The mud of her hut's walls, the straw of the roof. He could finally see them. They continued on through the village, showing the white man the town square, the small fishing boats that formed from hollowed-out tree trunks that the men carried with them when they walked the few miles down to the coast. Afia forced herself to see things through new eyes, too. She smelled the sea salt wind as it touched the hairs in her nose, felt the bark of a palm tree as sharp as a scratch, saw the deep, deep red of the clay that was all around them. "Baba," Afia asked once the men had walked farther ahead of them, "why will Ajwa marry this man?" "Because her mother says so." A few weeks later, the white man came back to pay respects to Ajwa's mother, and Afia and all of the other villagers gathered around to see what he would offer. There was the bride price of 15 pounds. There were goods he'd brought with him from the castle, carried on the backs of Ashantis. Kobe made Afia stand behind him as they watched the servants come in with fabric, millet, gold, and iron. When they walked back to their compound, Kobe pulled Afia aside, letting his wives and other children walk in front of them. "Do you understand what just happened?" he asked her. In the distance, Baba slipped her hand into Fifi's. Afia's brother had just turned 11, but he could already climb up the trunk of a palm tree using nothing but his bare hands and feet for support. "The white man came to take Ajwa away," Afia said. Her father nodded. "The white men live in the Cape Coast castle. There, they trade goods with our people." "Like iron and millet?" Afia asked. Her father put his hand on her shoulder and kissed the top of her forehead. But when he pulled away, the look in his eyes was troubled and distant. "Yes, we get iron and millet, but we must give them things in return. That man came from Cape Coast to marry Ajwa, and there will be more like him who will come and take our daughters away. But you, my own, I have bigger plans for you than to live as a white man's wife. You will marry a man of our own village." Baba turned around just then, and Afia caught her eyes. Baba scowled. Afia looked at her father to see if he had noticed, but Kobe did not say a word. Afia knew who her choice for husband would be, and she dearly hoped her parents would choose the same man. Abeku Badu was next in line to be the village chief. He was tall, with skin like the pit of an avocado, and large hands with long, slender fingers that he waved around every time he spoke. He had visited their compound 4 times in the last month, and later that week, he and Afia would share a meal together. Abeku brought a goat. His servants carried yam and fish and palm wine. Baba and the other wives stoked their fires and heated the oil. The air smelled rich. That morning, Baba had plaited Afia's hair, 2 long braids on either side of her center part. They made her look like a ram, strong, willful. Afia had oiled her naked body and put gold in her ears. She sat across from a beku as they ate, pleased as he stole appreciative glances. "Were you at Ajua's ceremony?" Baba asked once all of the men had been served and the women finally began to eat. "Yes, I was there, but only briefly. It is a shame Ajua will leave the village. She would have made a good wife." "Will you work for the British when you become chief?" Afia asked. Kobe and Baba sent her sharp looks, and she lowered her head, but lifted it to find Abeku smiling. "We work with the British, Afia, not for them. That is the meaning of trade. When I am chief, we will continue as we have, facilitating trade with the Ashantis and the British." Afia nodded. She wasn't exactly sure what this meant, but she could tell from her parents' looks that it was best to keep her mouth shut. Abeku Badu was the first man they had brought to meet her. Afia wanted desperately for him to want her, but she did not yet know what kind of man he was, what kind of woman he required. Abeku finished eating. He shook hands with everyone in the family and stopped by Afia's mother. "You will let me know when she is ready," he said. Baba clutched a hand to her chest and nodded soberly. Kobe and the other men saw Abeku off as the rest of the family waved. That night, Baba woke Afia up while she was sleeping on the floor of her hut. Afia felt the warmth of her mother's breath against her ear as she spoke. "When your blood comes, Afia, you must hide it. You must tell me and no one else," she said. "Do you understand?" She handed Afia palm fronds that had turned into soft rolled sheets. "Place these inside of you and check them every day. When they turn red, you must tell me." Afia looked at the palm fronds held in Baba's outstretched hands. She didn't take them at first, but when she looked up again, there was something like desperation in her mother's eyes. And because the look had softened Baba's face somehow, and because Afia also knew desperation, that fruit of longing, she did as she was told. Every day, Afia checked for red, but the palm fronds came out greenish-white, as always. In the spring, the chief of the village grew ill, and everyone watched Abeku carefully to see if he was ready for the task. He married 2 women in those months, Arekwa the wise, and Millicent, the half-caste daughter of a Fanti woman and a British soldier. The soldier had died from fever, leaving his wife and 2 children much wealth to do with as they pleased. Afia prayed for the day all of the villagers would call her Afia the Beauty, as Abeku called her. Later, Baba nodded and turned towards Afia, who quickly looked away. That night, just 2 days after her 15th birthday, her blood came. It was not the powerful rush of ocean waves that Afia had expected it to be, but rather a simple trickle, rain dripping drop by drop from the same spot of a hut's roof. She cleaned herself off and waited for her father to leave Baba so that she could tell her. "Baba," she said, showing her the palm fronds painted red, "I have gotten my blood." Baba placed a hand over her lips. "Who else knows?" "No one," Afia said. "You will keep it that way, do you understand? When anyone asks you if you have become a woman yet, you will answer, no." Afia nodded. She turned to leave, but a question was burning hot coals in the pit of her stomach. "Why?" she finally asked. Baba reached into Afia's mouth and pulled out her tongue, pinching the tip with the sharp fingernails. "Who are you that you think you can question me? If you do not do as I say, I will make sure you never speak again." She released Afia's tongue, and for the rest of that night, Afia tasted her own blood. I'll stop there.
It is so wonderful to see so many people here, and thank you for reading with me. It's like, I guess I'll read from the beginning as well. And just a little background, this Augustown is a one-day novel, but it's a day that's haunted, terribly haunted by history. And it's haunted by, in particular, by an event that should have happened in Jamaica in 1920. And I'll tell you a little bit about that event. Because in a strange way, you actually know the end of this story, even though you don't know. But this is the beginning of the story that you know the end of. In 1920, a man called Alexander Bedwood prophesies in Jamaica that he's going to fly to heaven. It's a racialized time. Specifically, he's going to fly to heaven, get bolts of lightning in his hand, and come back and just smite all of Kingston. To which the peasants in Jamaica cheer. The middle class and upper class are not as happy about this. Eventually, Bedwood is arrested and he dies in jail. Why you know the end of this story is because Bedwood's second in command, after his death, he gathers all of Bedwood's teaching, links up with another guy, Hines and Howell. They publish a book called The Promised Key, which is largely regarded as the first book of Rastafari. And so if you listen to songs like If I Had the Wings of a Dove or I'll Fly Away to Zion, there's a way in which these songs hold within them the memory of Bedwood. And so that story, it haunts this present day. So yeah, that's all you need to know. So this is how it begins. By the way, this is... I'm just reading over the first chapter. There's a lots of violent things that happen. It gets better after this first chapter. It truly does. Yeah. So here it begins. Blind people hear and taste and smell what other people cannot. And what Ma Taffy smells on this early afternoon makes her sit up straight. She smells it high and ripe and stink on the air, like a bright green jackfruit in season being pulled to the rocky ground below. The smell is coming down John Golding Road, right alongside the boy child, something attached to him like a spirit, but not quite. She has been hearing him for a while now. All the sniffling, hiccuping, short of breath sounds, but it is not the crying that makes Ma Taffy alert. There is nothing special in this. The old woman is used to the little boy coming from school, wet-eyed and vexed with the world for whatever injustice he feels has befallen him this time. A backbone, she often thinks to herself. That little boy is in need of a backbone. He has stopped crying now, yet something is still coming to the house with him, something with a smell, so Ma Taffy is paying careful attention. A spliff glows idly between her fingers. She has abandoned it for the moment. She continues, however, to draw in breath after breath with the same slow deliberateness, holding on to it, trying to separate the things she knows from the things she does not know. She knows, for instance, the various smells of herself, the dull flavor of ganja fresh on her breath, the carbolic soap she washed with earlier, and underneath that, her own old woman smells. She knows the smell of the wooden house behind her, of the zinc fence rusting slowly, of the chicken coop round back, and even the smell of each of the 5 hens, separate from the rank smell of the rooster. She can smell the mangoes and the cherries and the Otaheite apples ripening together, and then all the vague but distinct everyday smells of Augustown, coal fires burning, turned cornmeal turning, crack rice boiling, the sweat of black women standing over pots, the sweat of black men standing in the streets, and then there it is, behind all of it, something else, a smell slightly sour but tight and choking like rats. Irie Tafari, otherwise known as Ma Taffy, is almost always calmly disposed, but the thought of rats makes her twitch. It was over 10 years ago. They had been breeding in the roof, a whole colony, rat mama and rat papa having plenty rat picnic, and those plenty rat picnic having even more rat picnic, and it had created that smell, thin and sour and choking. There were the nightly scuttling sounds, and before long, rat shit started to drizzle around the house like a small intermittent rain. Ma Taffy should have known long before the terrible thing happened that it was going to happen. On that night she had been dreaming of a whistling sound. It was all around her. The whistling grew into a moaning. She opened her eyes, but it was so dark that she couldn't see the ever-expanding belly of the ceiling, how it was creakily reaching towards her. But she heard above the moaning the frantic rats shrieking, hissing, swearing, chattering. The roof gave out with a pop, and she finally saw them, hundreds of the snake-tailed rodents falling towards her, scrabbling the air, their beady eyes shining red in the dark. Strange, Ma Taffy sometimes thinks how a coming autoclops had made her open her eyes wide in anticipation instead of closing them for protection. The rats gouged out one eye completely and badly damaged the other. If she tips her head to a certain angle and looks out of the lower portion, she can manage to see a shadowy grey world, but this takes so much effort and reveals so little that Ma Taffy hardly does so. Instead, she has grown used to the darkness. Ma Taffy lifts the spliff back to her mouth. She's growing nervous. Another coming autoclops. Steady your heart, Taffy, she whispers to herself. Steady. But Ma Taffy is already the great expert of steadiness. This is the woman who sits in the self-same spot where she's sitting now, no matter how the world tilts around her. She once sat there during a whole hurricane. And even worse, whenever the bad men and rude boys of Augustown are trading bullets with Babylon or with themselves, while almost everyone else in Augustown is locked tight inside their houses, Ma Taffy just sits there, steady, blinking her useless eyes. 2 years earlier, when the newly formed Angola gang found themselves under siege by the police, Ma Taffy did even more than just stay outside. She stood up, reached for her cane, and walked down the stairs of her veranda. She walked straight into the middle of the road and into the line of fire. At once the bullets stopped. Ma Taffy stood regal in the road. Her dreadlocks were piled on top of her head, a green and yellow turban wrapped around them. She knew that from their hiding place the Angola boys were watching her confused, and that from another hiding place the police were also watching, probably making desperate hand gestures. Ma Taffy alone was steady and sure. She walked just a few hundred yards over to the half-built house that had been abandoned years ago, it probably having occurred to the owners that if one had enough money to build a house, then one had enough money to leave Augustown. Thick Circe vines now grew through the concrete, drawing the structure back into the vegetation. Ma Taffy stepped through the open doorway, and 5 rude boys looked up, their faces suddenly softened by a kind of innocence. They were just boys after all, though they tried not to let this show. One of them, no more than 17, shook himself out of his embarrassment and addressed Ma Taffy. "Old woman, why you come here for? Go back to your house." Ma Taffy turned her face towards the voice. Her yellowed eye found the face it wanted and seemed to scrutinize it. After a moment, the man-boy added more respectfully, "Please, Ma Taffy, It's not safe out here. The old woman remained silent. There were many things she was being careful not to say, and yet in the quiet of the moment, the shadow of these things passed clearly between herself and the man-boy. Listen, boy, who not too long ago was still sucking milk from his mama titty, don't pass your place with me. Matafi's lips weren't moving, and yet the man-boy was hearing the old woman's voice in his head. Her voice continued. I understand them calling you soft paw now, and maybe that is right. Maybe every boy picnic when him get to a certain age should have a say in him own name, cause he don't get to choose much else in this life. But Marlon is the name I know you as since you was just a little boy running to my veranda, hiding behind me skirt from your mama long belt. Matafi paused and swallowed, and then the shadow of the unsaid things grew thicker and darker. Listen, me know what them did do to Petey. Me know how for the past 2 months him was doing yard work for a woman who lived up in Hope Pastures. Me know how this woman must did get it into her head that him thief money from off her table and that she called Babylon to report him. From that same veranda over there, I sit and hear everything. I hear when Babylon come into Augustown the night, the sound of them jeeps like they was crushing more than just the stones on the road. They stop in front of the rum bar, go inside and drag Petey out. Petey, who was already so deep under him whites that he never understand what was going on, and I hear how they address him. Dirty yard boy, what you do with the woman money? This was the new corporal boy, a tall, mager fellow who's so mager that if he turns sideways, you almost don't see him at all. Is him who take out the rifle and use the butt and cuff Petey hard on him head, so hard that Petey fall to the ground and blood start run down him face, and same time he gets sober. This tall, mager corporal, like maybe he trying to prove just how big and bad him is, getting more irate for no reason at all. He start to shout at Petey, tell me right now what you do with the woman, rascal money. And Petey now just shaking him head, the blood dripping from him forehead into him eye, and him just saying the same thing over and over, calm, like trying not to cause no trouble. Me no not about money, officer. Me not take nobody money. This corporal boy then spit on the ground and him lean over and push him face right up to Petey. Use a fucking thief, he whisper. Petey say again with a little more strength this time, me a no thief. And he begin to reach into him pocket, and it happened so quick. The corporal boy raise him rifle, turn it round, and Petey's head explode like a bright green jackfruit that fall and bust on the ground below. They strap Petey's body to the front of the Jeep as if it was nothing but a wild hog they catch up in Blue Mountain, and they drive round Augustown, and you might remember, Softpaw, how we was all so quiet then, but Babylon never understand that ours was the quiet of old and hungry tigers who wondering if maybe we have the strength to pounce, because if Babylon did understand that, then maybe them would have known to look a little bit scared as well. They drive out at last and take Petey with them. Softpaw, me know is you did go out into the road later that night and find the wallet that Petey was reaching into in pocket for, and when you open it, there was nothing more than the $5 the woman from Hope Pastures did pay him for the work him did do. Not a thing more, but we hear it on radio, the same story that Babylon always tell, how they come into Augustown to look for a known criminal, how the criminal opened fire upon them, how they return fire and kill them. You said this thing don't concern old people like me, but that is only cause you're still talking with titty milk in your mouth. When the shadow of these things had finished passing between the two, the man-boy trembled a little. Matafi turned her yellow eye away and said aloud for the first time, a simple instruction, follow me. Listen, old woman, Softpaw began to protest, but Matafi was already walking towards the back of the house, stepping through another open doorway, this one leading towards the river. Softpaw shook his head but followed. I soon come back, he whispered to the others. Soft Paw had earned his name because of how lightly he was able to step, soft like a cat, materializing in front of people like a ghost, and yet soft and soundless as he was able to move, the blind woman moved even softer. As they walked around the circumference of Augustown, Soft Paw fought to keep up. They had walked almost a mile before the old woman stopped. You know why you're there? Yes, Ma Taffy. Willie's corner shop perched just up there above us. Inside, you will find a tall Maga corporal. She lowered her face and spat. Rasclad coward not even have the courage to be where the other Babylon boys is fighting the fight with him start. The old woman was quiet for a moment and then said, "Go and do what you done decide you have to do." Softpaw pulled the gun from where he had stuffed it into the back of his pants. His waistband slapped against his taut and muscular back. He seemed to weigh the gun between his hands, and for the second time that day, he was a child again, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Matafi started to say something, but stopped. She knew she had to allow him to be a man and a warrior in his own way. She turned and walked back the same way she had come from. Softpaw slunk up to the corner shop. Matafi hadn't walked for a minute before the retort of the Glock seemed to suck all the silence out of the world. She felt the sound in every wrinkle of her face, and then she felt it in her chest. She stopped where she was. In a moment, the grass behind her was being trampled. Softpaw was no longer taking soft steps. He was running. She heard his ragged breaths and felt the wind as he ran past. It was a hot day. Even without being able to see, Matafi knew that the river was so low it was not flowing. It was instead a series of stagnant ponds from which mosquitoes were hatching every second. She felt the insects around her face and her arms. She heard them in her ears. She took a breath and continued, steady, steady, back to her house. You see, this is the Matafi I have always known. Nothing ever rattles her. So it is strange that on this afternoon, lifting her head to the wind, she is instructing herself to stay calm. The smell is thick now. She knows the little boy is turning into the yard, climbing the steps onto the veranda towards her. "Come, little boy," she says. "Come, sit down beside your grandma." In fact, she's the boy's great aunt, but in this household and to everyone in Augustown, it seems an unnecessary distinction to make. The boy sits. The old woman sniffs the air again and almost gags. She puts a hand on the boy's knees. Kaya makes a whimpering sound and draws very close to her, his head now resting on the old woman's shoulder. Matafi decides it is not yet time to ask, "What is the matter? Who trouble you?" She knows that whatever is going to happen, whatever is going to pour out into the world, it will pour out soon enough. It will happen as certain as the midnight rain of rats. And if she can hold it off for just a little longer, she will. So instead, she asks a question that surprises even herself as she asks it. "Kaya, have I ever told you the story of the flying preacher man?"
So I have a question for Miss Gyasi.
Gyasi.
What inspired you to write this book, and how did you feel about having it published as a debut?
So I started writing Homegoing because my sophomore year of college, I received a fellowship to travel to Ghana and conduct research for a novel. And initially, I had a different idea in mind. I thought I wanted to write something about a mother and a daughter, so I thought it would be nice to travel to my own mother's hometown, which is in the central region of Ghana, pretty close to Cape Coast. And see if anything kind of occurred to me. Nothing did. And so I was feeling, as though I had wasted everybody's time and money and faith in me. until a friend came to visit, and kind of on a whim, we decided to go see the Cape Coast Castle. And it was while there on the tour of the castle that the guide started to talk to us about how the British soldiers who used to live and work in the castle would sometimes marry the local women, which was something I'd never heard before and really fascinated me. And then from there, he took us down to see the dungeons. And so I knew kind of immediately that I wanted to write something that could juxtapose those two experiences, that of somebody living upstairs as the wife and that of somebody in the dungeons. But I didn't really know anything beyond that. As far as how I felt to have it come out, ecstatic, you know. I think, you know, if you work on something for that many years, suddenly, I don't know, it starts to take over your life in this way. So it was nice to let them go. So I felt incredibly happy about that.
Kai, how about you? What inspired this novel for you?
Oh, wow. Two strange stories that came together, I guess. Bedwood, I mean, I actually lived above Augustown, so it's a community that I could look down to. But I wondered what that meant to literally, the middle-class Jamaicans, they often live on the hill, and so you literally look down on people. And what does that mean? And so I'd heard the story of Bedwood, and it was always told, it's always a story of the idiot, the stupid man who thought he could fly. And I thought there's another way to tell that story. So that's one part of it. The other part is that I have a very good friend who some of you should know, or I hope some of you have read his book. He's a brilliant poet. His name is Aishan Hutchinson. And once he ended up staying at my house. We were college students at the time, and he was between houses. And just one night he was there, and he was, I don't know why the conversation that night went into a really emotional place, but it did, and he started telling me about the time when he was a kid and a teacher grabbed him by his dreadlocks and cut off his hair. And that's what's about to happen in that bit. I mean, the boy has come home because a teacher's just cut off his hair, and everything that is about to happen on that day happens because the teacher made that decision. And that's what Matafi smells. And so I've always wanted to tell that story.
As authors, I'm wondering, I read Homegoing, and it has such a distinct structure. And I'm wondering how you decided on the structure, and then Mr. Miller, how does the author decide how he's going to tell that story?
I mean, mine was relatively easy. It's as I kind of said at the beginning. I wanted to tell a novel that happens in one day, but I guess I am interested in how. And it says in a little prologue, it kind of says as much. I'm interested in how a day contains all of history. That everything that's going to happen in this day has been delivered to us. And so the novel takes place over several years, but all the flashbacks are relevant to this day. And I guess in a weird way that became my structure, that it would be contained in 4 hours, and every flashback would lead us back to the day. And, you know, the day would be this kind of composite of history, you know, weird. That's another really weird way to answer. Sorry.
For me, the structure was the thing that took the longest to figure out. Initially, I thought it would be much more traditionally structured. I thought I wanted something that took place in the present. So if you've read the book, kind of with the last two characters, though they looked a lot different back then, and then just flash back to 18th century Ghana, so the first two characters. And I worked that way probably for about 3 years and 100 pages before I realized that I was not at all interested in that. Wow. And what I wanted to do instead was to kind of be able to follow time, to be able to kind of feel the full sweep of time. And so I needed a structure, I thought, that would allow me to stop in as many generations as possible from the beginning to the end, just so that it was easier, I guess, to see that through line, to understand how these events come from these events, which came from those events, which came from those events. And I felt like that idea got lost in the original structure. But it took me a long time to do that.
In the book, you chronicle, in a sense, the role of the Ghanaians in the slave trade, and how much of that actually came from real history, or was it conjecture with a few facts? In other words, do the Ghanaians hold that history fairly accurately, or did you have to creatively input it?
So, that part of the novel was something that I did have to do a lot of research on because it was something I didn't know very much about. And I think it's the kind of thing that Ghanaians do talk about, but kind of in whispers, So you hear about it, but you don't know that much about it. And yet, at the same time, when I visited the Cape Coast Castle, the tour guide was talking about it very freely. So it wasn't information that they were attempting to hide. It just is this thing, I think, that oftentimes slavery seems like something that belongs to America, belongs to Britain. It's not about us. That kind of mentality, I think, was kind of prevalent. I started with a research book called The Door of No Return by William St. Clair that really helped me to kind of see the castle as it might have been in the time period that I was interested in. It had a chapter on women, a chapter on the children, a chapter on, kind of the roles that each person would have been playing within this structure. And then there was another really great book called The Fanti and the Transatlantic Slave Trade by Rebecca Shumway. And that book took you through the different roles that the different ethnic groups played in slavery. So I think, a lot of the earlier chapters are held up by the truth, though obviously it's fiction at the end of the day.
Hi, I have a question about homegoing. I actually have a two-part question. There's a theme that runs through homegoing of fire and water. I wonder if you would expound upon that and, what it meant to you personally and, how you kept bringing that into the different stories. And then my other part is homegoing rather than homecoming. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the book really opened for me with this image of I wrote chronologically, so it happened for me as it happens for you, essentially. So the opening, the idea of somebody setting a really big fire and then escaping into it was the first thing that came to me. And in a lot of ways it has a kind of classic fairy tale feel. So there's this curse, there's a beautiful daughter and an evil stepmother, and those kinds of elements, I think, were things that I was really interested in and wanted to play with. For the curse of the fire, I thought it would be interesting to have the fire kind of come up throughout Afia's lineage. And so you have characters like Yao, who's scarred by fire, characters like Akua, who's visited by fire. And this was in part just a way to allow the chapters to cohere, because the structure that I was attempting to use was such a difficult one, or one that we don't typically see or read. I knew that one of the big challenges would be figuring out ways to allow the chapters to cohere. And so for Afia's chapter, there's the element of fire. For Essie's chapter, similarly, because she's sent through the Middle Passage, there's a relationship to water that kind of echoes that. And again, that's a way, so every time you see a descendant of either sister, and you see that element, you get to remember the sister without me having to put them into the chapter. So that was kind of a structural choice. As far as the word homegoing, so homegoing, the term traditionally referred to slave funerals. The idea was that when you died, your spirit could return to the country from which you had been ripped, to the place from which you had been ripped. And that's still used today in many African American funerals. I liked that, the kind of resonance, I guess, of the idea that you can carry your home with you regardless of where you've ended up. Seemed like the right thing for this book.
I hope that Mr. Miller would talk a little bit more about the myth of flying, especially in terms of African diasporic communities. If you just if you've paid attention to the literature and so forth, people talk about, the myth of the people could fly, and I didn't know if and how your character or the history of this figure might be part of that larger history, of that larger myth.
Yeah, no, he's definitely participating in that kind of mythology. I mean, it's strange because there is that mythology that is in the background, and it's particularly important to Rastafari as a religion. So, again, this is the myth of the flying African. I guess similar to Yaa's story about kind of homegoing. It's that we all had the ability to fly back. But what prevents you, at least in the Caribbean, what prevents you from being able to fly back is salt. And in Caribbean folklore, being given kind of salted provisions, salted pork, salted fish, all of that salt always weighs you down. And so in Rastafari philosophy, you eat ital food, which is food without salt, almost. And I always feel that there must be a link somewhere in the background there that it is giving us back our ability to fly back home. And so Bedouin is definitely participating in that kind of mythology. Ideas about salt and being salted and being weighed down, that always comes back. And certainly because he exists at that time where, Bedouin would have known people who would have been formerly enslaved people. I do wonder what it meant for them to see him make this prophecy and come out to see him fly or not fly. It's all kind of there. Another less than eloquent answer, but it's somewhere.
It made me think of the opening of Song of Solomon.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Oh, and not so much the opening, the end.
Yeah.
Which is when he surrenders. And there's another brilliant book by a Trinidadian writer called Lovelace called Salt, which uses that mythology again. It's all there.
Yeah.
First.
This is for Yaa. You were born in Ghana. Exactly where in Ghana?
Oh, I was born in a town called Mampong in the Ashanti region.
Oh, okay. And I know that Afias represents Friday born, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
And what does Yaa represent a day that you were born?
Yeah, so Yaa is the name for a girl born on Thursday.
Thursday. Okay. Okay. When did you leave Ghana, and when did you leave Ghana and went into the States? When did you?
I left Ghana when I was 2.
Okay. So you said you went back, when you went to the Cape Coast Castle. Was that your initial visit when you went, or had you gone there?
No, I actually went back with my whole family once before that when I was 11. But the trip when I was 20 was the only time that I had ever gone by myself. And so it felt like the trip that allowed me to get to know the country on my own terms, I guess.
This is a question for Mr. Miller.
Mr. Miller sounds so odd.
Sorry.
I always look behind me for my father.
I work in education. It's like default, Mr., Mrs., default.
Yeah, no, it's really pleasant.
It's a question about the choice of words when you're writing. Because you write poetry, I'm always really curious about writers who write fiction, prose, and poetry.
Yeah.
Your fiction is so rich and visual. I mean, like my skin was crawling when we were listening to that rat scene.
Oh, good. Because mine was as well.
Yeah. But I was wondering how do you go about stylistically when you're writing poetry and when you're writing prose?
Yeah. It's a hard thing because I am pretty arrogant as a poet. But it's just that few people intimidate me as a poet in poetry, whereas everyone intimidates me as a fiction writer. I read every fiction book and go, oh my God, I wish I could write like that. And in poetry, I think if you don't like me, you don't have taste. I apologize, really. But no, I don't. But I guess it comes down to this. I think, and I've said this a few times. I think when you write a book, you're always going to come across problems, and your job when you come across a problem is very simple. It's to solve it. There's something I used to do very badly. I used to try to, because I was so much more confident as a poet, I would try to solve the problems of fiction with a toolkit of poetry, which is something you can't do. And it would mean that the writing would suddenly become beautiful. I would throw every metaphor at it. I would, send 1,000 yellow butterflies flying across the landscape and load every butterfly as a kind of metaphor of the post-colonial condition. It was strong writing, but that's not the problems of fiction. The problems of fiction is always has to do with pace and character and tension, and I wasn't solving those problems. And so I become very strict on myself now that I can use poetry to accent prose, but I can't use it to solve the problems of prose. And so I think that's what you have to do. That when I write an essay and I come across the problems of the essay, I have to be an essayist in that moment. And when I write a novel and I come across a problem in the novel, I have to become a novelist in that moment, etc., etc. Yeah,
thank you all very much for coming.